Hey guys, welcome to an introduction on emojis as an e-language from a linguistics perspective. At the beginning of the semester, we briefly explored how writing is a technology. Writing is a tool that advances language, meaning, and thought. As we turn our attention to the e-languages of emojis, I want you to keep in mind that writing is also a technology that removes the body from the language. In other words, writing literally removes body language from communication. We actually learned about this notion a little when we explored tone in our video on all caps and alternating caps. What we found was that we rely on a variety of typological features to give our writing a tone, because otherwise, how would we convey prosodic features like a high-pitched voice in writing? Emojis along the same lines can also help convey tone. For example, I can say, "You are so ugly," or "You are so ugly, winky face," and the tone between those two sentences can be quite different with the use of the emoji. The later implying that my comment shouldn't be taken at surface level value, but that I am instead joking. Emojis can also replace body language the same way a waving hand emoji substitutes for a person waving their hand hello, as one might do in a face-to-face interaction. In another video, we're going to be exploring emojis as gestures, which means we'll look at how emojis convey expressions, body language, tone of voice, and are used to convey our feelings. This week, however, we're going to introduce ourselves to the linguistics of emojis. First, we'll answer the questions, are emojis an actual language? And are they replacing the language as we know it? We'll then naturally move the discussion forward into talking about emojis and their meanings as they relate to culture and linguistic competence. So we want to address the question of whether or not emojis are a real language. And on the one hand, you might make an argument in favor of this viewpoint, given the way emojis can function at the lexical and syntactic level. So we have emojis that can substitute for individual words, like the cake emoji for cake and the cat emoji for cat. So you could easily understand a sentence that reads, "I got you a cake and a cat." Some emoji combinations can also substitute for phrases. So instead of saying dumpster fire, I can use the trash can emoji and the fire emoji to replace the phrase dumpster fire. You may even have an argument that emojis can replace full sentences. So the backhand index pointing right emoji, followed by a face with rolling eyes emoji, followed by the backhand index pointing left emoji, carries the same meaning as the sentence, "I'm not listening." Examples like these tend to generate the idea that people are able to use emojis in the same way we can use a language like English, to communicate meaning and thought, because we see ways that emojis can supplement standard text. People also liken emojis to hieroglyphics, which is the formal writing system used in ancient Egypt and is considered to be one of the oldest forms of written language. So first, it's important to know that emojis don't descend from hieroglyphics, but it's also important to know that emojis can seemingly function the same way that hieroglyphics did, which is using ideograms and pictograms to represent language in writing. An ideograph is a character symbolizing the idea of a thing or a concept, such as the prohibited emoji that essentially conveys the concept of not allowed. Alternatively, a pictogram is a symbol that represents a word or phrase and resembles that physical object, such as the cake emoji, which resembles a cake. So there's a lot of debate about whether or not emojis are like hieroglyphics, and the answer to that might always be changing. But seemingly, it may be construed that since emojis seem similar to hieroglyphics, maybe this supports the notion that emojis are in fact a language. However, McCulloch points out that a language is not its writing system. A language is its spoken form. So spoken English is the language, and the writing system we have for English only reflects the spoken language. In fact, a language's writing system, like English's writing system, can change. But when the writing system changes, it doesn't mean that the new writing system becomes a new language. because a language is its spoken form. The writing system just represents the language. Just as hieroglyphics were themselves not a language, they were a writing system representing a spoken language. So what is a language? A language is a spoken, conventionalized, structured system of communication. A language has rules, a grammar, and it has a vocabulary, amongst many other things that are true of all languages. When two people come together who are fluent in the same language, they can use their linguistic knowledge of that language to express thought and have a complex conversation. They can also use their knowledge of the spoken language to transfer these ideas into writing, following the writing system of that language. An important feature of language is that with it, you can communicate complex thought, and writing is just the tool that advances the thought. So again, are emojis their own language, or are they part of a writing system much like hieroglyphics? Gretchen McCulloch says that you can actually test out whether or not emojis are their own well-developed language by performing the book test, which is to pick up the closest book to you, open it to a random page, point your finger to a word, translate that word into an emoji, show that emoji to someone else but don't give them any context, and see if they know what word that emoji represents, if they can tell you what that emoji means. I've actually tried it for you myself with two passages from a classic play. From these emojis, can you guess what I'm translating from English to emoji? If you think you have an idea, leave it in the comments. But I'm guessing that even those of you who consider yourself fluent in the language of emojis cannot easily identify these translations based on the emojis alone. And that is because emojis are not a language. If anything, they serve much like a writing system in that they can be used to represent meaning and ideas in a language. However, the meaning of an emoji is very speaker dependent and context dependent. Emojis are not yet a well-developed writing system that can stand on its own, as you saw in the book test. Though that's not to say they can't eventually become a well-working writing system. What we find is that people aren't using emojis as a substitute for language because one, we can't, and two, it's not a language, but rather emojis are being used as an addition to language to support a language system. While emojis are not a language in themselves, another popular myth is that emojis are a universal writing system, meaning emojis are a global language that transcend spoken language and allows for people from different languages to still convey meaning and thought to each other because everyone shares access to the same emojis. However, the meaning of an emoji is not actually universal. An emoji may mean one thing here in the US, but the same emoji may mean something completely different in another culture. For example, in the US, the thumbs up emoji may represent good or okay, but in the Middle East, this emoji reads the same as giving someone the middle finger in the US. Okay, so we'll avoid that emoji and just use the okay emoji instead. Not so fast. In Brazil and Turkey, the okay hand gesture is considered an insult and is also the equivalent of giving the middle finger in America. In the US, we may use the pile of poo emoji to be silly, amongst several other reasons, but in Japan, this emoji tends to be taken more to mean good luck. Okay, well, what about the eggplant? It's a vegetable, right? Well, some people may use it that way, but if you're living in the US and a few other countries, this emoji may have a strong sexual connotation. Similarly, some cultures take the peach for what it is, a fruit, but other countries translate this emoji to mean butt. Okay, let's step back and acknowledge that we just compared the meaning of a handful of emojis of primarily English speakers in the US to speakers of Middle Eastern languages, Turkish, Portuguese, and even Japanese. So on the one hand, maybe we can assume that those emojis only meant different things in these different countries because the people actually don't speak English. They're coming from languages other than English. So maybe it is just a language difference. Maybe in English-speaking countries or parts of the world that speak English, the peach emoji always means butt, and you'd have to speak English to have that understanding. Well, a study has been done on that. And what they found is that even in the same language, emoji meaning can be different. By the way, I'm providing a link to the study below in the video description. So this study actually found that a lot of the same emojis were popular across English-speaking countries. So for everyone in these 9 regions, the generic smiley face emoji was the most used emoji. When the researchers looked at the second most frequently used emoji in these 9 countries, we can still see a small theme in that the US, Jamaica, the United Kingdom, and Trinidad, in that the face with tears of joy emoji was the second most used emoji in those areas. So cool. A lot of these English-speaking countries are using a lot of the same emojis. But when the researchers dug down deeper, they actually found that even though they are using the same emojis, they're using them to mean different things. So here we get the unfortunate news that the peach emoji does not in fact mean but in every English-speaking country. We do see some universality in some emojis, meaning the kissy face primarily means I love you, and the praying hands primarily means praying. But overall, we get an answer to our question that sharing the same language with someone doesn't mean we share the same meaning of emojis. The use and meaning of an emoji is deeply culturally specific. There are plenty of studies out there that show which emojis are most popular in which countries, but those studies don't adequately explain why that might be. They miss the cultural context. So emojis, their meanings are rooted in culture. Their meanings are not innately universal. Now, you may also be noticing when you look at this data that the eggplant emoji and the peach emoji are actually shown to mean eggplant and fruit in the US. Well, not in my generation. This same study went on to find what you could possibly assume, that the meaning of emojis can change across age groups. So if you look at this chart, yes, a peach and an eggplant mean something different to an 18 to 24-year-old than people who are perhaps older. Though I'm most certainly older than 24, so I think the 25 to 35-year-olds lied when they took this survey. We can also see a distinction in the way age groups interpret the hugging face emoji, where older and younger generations see it to mean that's cool, and the middle generations interpret it primarily as a hug. So we already know that emoji meaning can be culturally bound, and now we can also see that they can be demographically bound, in this case by your age. But a survey is not the only way for us to research what emojis mean. In fact, you and I both know that emojis can have more than one meaning. Even if you get 2 speakers together from the same language, from the same culture, and from the same age group and gender, speakers are still going to interpret the meaning of an emoji differently. For example, when given a string of emojis, 2 people will not always interpret them the same way. See my cluster of emojis above? Take a minute to think about what those emojis are saying. What do you think this cluster of emojis means? You probably won't be able to piece it together unless I told you, or unless it related specifically to a context that you and I both shared. In discourse analysis, we have to look at its context of use to understand its meaning. There's a great website, Emojipedia, that is continually tracking how emojis are used in context, and they provide definitions for the various ways that people are using emojis. In this presentation, you've seen me use the speaking head emoji a couple of times. Emojipedia says that this is a silhouette of a person speaking with lines demonstrating speech being expelled, sometimes used in the context of shouting or mansplaining. So how does Emojipedia know that this emoji is being used these various ways? By looking at its use in context. Here we have 3 real-life illustrations reflecting the 3 dominant ways that people are using this emoji. The first person is just using the emoji to introduce a quote. The second user is using the emoji to indicate a shouting voice, in this case, raising your voice for a cause. The final user is using the emoji to represent mansplaining, which for those of you who don't know is the term used to reference a man who may try to overly explain or simplify things for women, assuming a woman can't possibly understand what he is saying. So the emoji in this context represents a man explaining something to a woman. The only way we can understand and identify these various uses is by looking at what people mean by them in their context of use, by performing a discourse analysis, which we're going to continue to learn more about in other videos. But let's wrap up this intro to emojis by highlighting a few linguistic-based insights. Like spoken language or like any written form, emojis reflect your group membership. When you use an emoji and you use it a specific way to mean a very specific thing to a specific person or group of people that know how you are using it, it reflects your membership to that group. The way you use emojis can reflect your age, they can reflect the region and the culture that you identify with, and they can reflect your social groups. For example, I've come to find more young people that are now leaving behind the traditional face with tears of joy emoji and are now using the skull emoji to communicate laughter. I can tell you that this is certainly not a universal meaning or understanding of the skull emoji, and that the use of the skull emoji this way is certainly presently a marked use of this emoji. And by marked, I mean that using this emoji to denote laughter is not common. The way you use emojis can say a lot about your identity as a person. And if you have ever taken other linguistics courses with me or watched any of my other videos, then you already know that that language is a symbol of identity. And we learned in an earlier video that writing is also a symbol of identity. And here we're learning that emojis are also a symbol of identity. Another takeaway is that when you are using emojis, you are demonstrating linguistic competence. Understanding the meaning of an emoji and using the right emoji to mean the right thing is a sign of your linguistic competence. Linguistic competence is a concept we learned a little bit about when we learned about the linguistics of hyperlinks. But to give you another frame of reference, we demonstrate linguistic competence in oral communication when we use correct pronunciation. We demonstrate linguistic competence in oral communication when we use the correct word. So for example, knowing to use the word highway instead of saying the big road that people drive fast on. We demonstrate linguistic competence when we form syntactically sound sentences, such as saying, I want a cookie, instead of saying, me want cookie, like Cookie Monster from Sesame Street. Similarly, we demonstrate linguistic competence when we know we can substitute nouns with appropriate pictograms, such as I got you a cake emoji and a cat emoji. It also takes linguistic competence to know that combining the trash can emoji and the fire emoji can be translated as the phrase dumpster fire, and that the bomb emoji, shell emoji, and bikini emoji can be translated as the meaning bombshell bikini. And that either of these emoji combinations can only be interpreted appropriately by competent language speakers, familiar with the expressions. In these ways, emojis reflect linguistic competence. A final takeaway is that when you are using emojis, you are demonstrating sociolinguistic competence. This means that you use the appropriate emojis at the appropriate times. If you've ever watched my videos on sociolinguistics, then you know sociolinguistics is the study of basically sociology and language. And in this field, one of the things you'll find is that there are cultural rules and norms that guide what is okay to say and what isn't okay to say, and when it is okay to say something and when it isn't okay to say something. For example, when my brother and I get in an argument, more so when we were younger, if he had an opinion I didn't like, I could outright say, your opinion is stupid. Conversely, if my boss had an opinion that I didn't like, can you even imagine how well it would go over if I told my boss, your opinion is stupid? Probably not so well. There are cultural and social rules that guide what is appropriate and what is not appropriate to say, and when you can and cannot say certain things. Thus, sociolinguistic competence is saying the appropriate thing at the appropriate times with the appropriate people. And we do this with emojis, in that we consider the cultural and social meanings and implications of using certain emojis in certain conversations. Emoji sociolinguistic competence is knowing that perhaps sometimes we shouldn't use too many emojis or any emojis at all. So perhaps this means you wouldn't use emojis at all in a professional work email. Not because you are not linguistically competent with emojis, but because you know socioculturally that this isn't typically a place people are permitted to use emojis. The main thing I want to stress is that the way to make sense of the way you and I are using our emojis is by looking into the context of use, looking at how we are using them. On that note, in case you were still wondering about what I meant by these emojis from a few slides ago, it was, this professor is tired of writing and speaking. I'm on information overload, preparing this short video on emojis. But I had fun learning about them, and I hope you did too. Until next time, bye.